Hi, Damian. We're here at the Voices Festival, and you'll be speaking. You have spoken this morning, and you'll be speaking tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And this morning we discussed the issue of trust in the media. It's declining everywhere. What's happening? What you think? What's your thoughts about it?
Well, if you're a journalist, you probably think any decline in trust in the media is a bad thing. And I sympathize with that view, but if trust is declining, I think we have to ask a slightly different question, which is, why is trust in the media declining? And that could be for all sorts of reasons. It could be because, of course, as we know, the amount of money available to pay journalists has declined rapidly in the last decade. The resources available to do long-term, independent investigations that serve the public interest, for example, is declining. And there has always been very bad journalism which is captured by the state on the one hand or by private interests. Media companies that have been acquired by large industrial groups and as a result have changed their editorial line. They serve an interest other than the public interest. So for me, if media are being mistrusted, that's not necessarily the problem, because sometimes we're right to distrust the media. We need to ask, how do you build a media system which is worthy of people's trust, where independence is protected, where quality journalism is protected, where journalists actually have the time and the resources and the incentives to search for truth. And that is a much more complicated question.
Do you have an example of such a system that would, like, if not exist, get close to it?
Well, sometimes when we have these debates, we think about this in terms of a golden age. And, you know, a true golden age never really existed. There was always a lot of bad journalism, but there were periods where you had a powerful and relatively independent media, and where you had regulatory frameworks which broke up big concentrations of power, which prevented media mergers, which would result in even bigger concentrations of power, and where you had independent regulation of journalism ethics by journalists' unions, professional associations, press councils, etc., which were not captured either by the state or by private interests. So there were periods in the post-war period in Europe, for example, where we got pretty close to having a public interested media. And it's no coincidence that we had relatively effective democratic debate, democracy that broadly worked during that period, and you had much higher levels of trust, not only in the media, but also in institutions more generally.
Tomorrow you'll be giving a talk on specifically like what is now called mainstream media. Mm-hmm. Do you have your own definition of mainstream media? Can you tell us what mainstream media is?
Well, I think you have to actually get to the underlying economics. All media markets are subject to the same economic pressures, pressures of concentration, network effects, and in these media markets you do have the emergence of relatively powerful gatekeeper positions. And obviously we had that in the press, we had it in broadcasting because of the even higher levels of investment necessary to enter that market. We're in a different world now. All sorts of people call themselves media, all sorts of people call themselves journalists, there are influencers and so forth. But I would argue that you have the same economic pressures towards concentration, and we will face some of the same debates that we faced in the past about how to limit those concentrations of power, how to put ethics into the mix, and how that all needs to be reflected in a constitutional law framework where we balance the right to freedom of expression and the freedom of the media or freedom of the press with other rights and the rights of others in a way which citizens can understand. Because if citizens don't believe that the mainstream media actually work for them. They're right not to trust them. They're absolutely right not to trust them. But we can, if we think this through, this is like a really difficult puzzle of how to modernize, develop the constitutional principles and all of the kind of detailed regulation and the economic regulation and markets shaping regulation, which actually make these things work as a system. I believe we can actually fix this. It's going to take a long time, but we can fix it. And already the European Union, in the form of the Digital Services Act and the European Media Freedom Act, the EU is already building those institutions. They're not going to get it perfect at the beginning. There's going to take a lot more work to do it, but we're already on that journey.
And maybe can you give us, I understand that we're already on that journey. Can you give us one or maybe two things that could be done even more to make sure, like some guarantees that that it's getting on the right way?
Well, take a topical issue. The Digital Services Act obliges X, the platform, to do certain things, to conduct risk assessments, that it's not going to lead to systemic risks for democracy, for example, in terms of its design, and to provide data to public authorities, the services controllers, and also the EU, the European Commission. X is refusing to do that. We're already headed for a collision between the European institutions, the Digital Services Act, and the X, the platform, and therefore, of course, the US government. The Commission has to stand firm. Just as the Brazilians did when their Supreme Court required the removal of a certain number of accounts by X in Brazil, when X refused to remove those accounts, they were suspended in Brazil. In Europe, we need to be prepared to deliver the sanctions, even if that means switching X off, which, let's face it, these days is not a great loss. We should switch it off and ensure that platforms that operate in Europe operate by our rules, by our democratic standards. And it's extremely important that the politicians realize this is a line that we have to draw very, very clearly.
Okay, thanks. And one last question, because this festival is also meant to be a place where young reporters and students in journalism actually learn about the profession as well. Do you have one message to young journalists or students journalists? One thing that you would like to advise them?
This is not an easy time to go into journalism. Everybody can see that, but I know from my own students that people have a passion for it because it's an important role to play in society. You're seeking the truth, you're defending the public interest. But I think any young journalist, I would say that you're likely to face pressures to compromise, whether that's blurring the boundary between editorial and advertising, or some other kind of blurring of boundaries. And you see that all the time, receiving of payments for certain stories, payments to promote certain stories, payments to suppress certain stories. This has to be resisted. So any young journalist, I would say, you may find it a boring part of your training to look at ethics and regulation, but I think in many ways, particularly in this coming period, they're going to be the most important thing. So learn your ethics and stick to them, come what may.
Thank you.
Thanks.